Well, nickel and other battery metals are poised to benefit as demand for EVs continues to grow. Our next guest believes this is a once-in-a-century opportunity for Canada. However, despite soaring commodity prices for base metals, the junior mining sector remains in a bear market. Let's bring in Martin Turenne. He's president and CEO of FPX Nickel. Welcome, Martin. I guess, why is the junior sector struggling so much to raise funds when the market itself is doing pretty well?
Yeah, thanks, Tara, for having us on. It is really just a fundamental disconnect. We get headlines in the newspapers and in the press every day about the build out of the EV future, announcements about new battery plants, and every major car maker, needing to transition to EVs. So the capital investments are really being made at that end of the sector right now in terms of the EV plants and the battery plants. But upstream of that, in the mining sector, we're still kind of starved of capital, and that's something that I think will change over the course of time. But that trickle upstream has not yet happened yet.
How is it affecting your company? You're in the middle of a big investment in central BC.
Yeah, so FPX is focused on the development of a very large nickel deposit in British Columbia. We put out a study earlier this week that shows that we have the potential to be the largest producer of battery-grade nickel sulfate in the world. Nickel sulfate is the chemical that goes into the EV batteries. These can be challenging times. We live in an era, I think, where we have a bit of a fast food mentality among investors. They want that immediate sort of sugar rush. Particularly speculative investors have been spoiled in recent years by parabolic moves in things like Bitcoin, cryptocurrency generally, and the marijuana stocks as well a few years ago. The mining sector hasn't yet provided that sugar high of those parabolic returns. However, we have started to see it in places like lithium and in uranium, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see it in nickel as well.
It's really interesting when you're thinking of the sugar high, and in some ways nickel is a victim of its own success. We've heard that some automakers are looking for chemistries that use less nickel. Do you think that's going to be a big impact on the industry moving forward?
We really envision a sector in the auto industry where there's going to be a mix of chemistries, and I think that's becoming quite clear, where the base models put out by automakers will oftentimes be nickel-free. However, the more premium models will have high nickel chemistries. And so in the same way you have different sort of trims and for different entry points in vehicles, I think you'll see the same thing with batteries. And frankly, that's a good thing. If we were 100% reliant on high nickel chemistries in EVs, we would not, as a world, stand a chance of sort of electrifying the vehicle fleet. So the mix of chemistries is a good thing. And what that means is there's going to be very strong nickel demand, but not so much that it's going to lead to insane price moves that would lead to more sustained longer-term substitution.
I guess when we think big picture, it was almost more than a decade ago that we saw China investing heavily in the nickel space. They now control about 40% of global supply, I believe. How can Canada compete with that?
Yeah, China certainly has taken the lead in nickel and in critical minerals generally. It's something that they benefit from sort of a coordinated central planning approach, whereas Canada and North America and Europe obviously don't have that benefit. With respect to Canada and the rest of the world, how do we catch up? I think there needs to be a higher degree of coordination between government and industry, absolutely. And that, we've seen that the Canadian government, for example, is stepping up and providing financial contributions and favorable sort of tax incentives to the build out of things like EV plants and the battery plants. And, we know the government has allocated around $3.8 billion in the last budget towards building out that critical mineral strategy. That's about a tenth of what the US has said it's going to do. I think Canada is uniquely well positioned. Listen, we're the only major Western country that has both an automotive, a thriving automotive sector, as well as an abundance of critical minerals. So it is really a once in a century opportunity, and it's going to require more active engagement and funding support from government in collaboration with industry.
Is there anything specific you'd like to see the federal government do here?
Yeah, there are a lot of things. FPX, we are coordinating a response to the federal government's critical minerals strategy discussion paper. For companies like ours that have advanced stage deposits, we really don't benefit from the flow-through tax regime. That regime is really aimed at the early stage exploration, but it leaves advanced stage projects in a bit of an orphan period And so we would hope to see the government kind of expand the funding and the sort of the beneficial tax credits to also fund things like metallurgical work, engineering studies, and environmental baseline studies. All of those types of expenditures are not currently see any government support. So we'd certainly like to see that expanded by the federal government.
And we know one thing that Canada has is almost this inherent, unique position when it comes to these metals. What could we do better as a country in general to capitalize on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of messaging here that needs to be done. In order to transition to a decarbonized, electrified future, we're going to need a lot of mining. So we know a lot of mined commodities are going to have to come out of the ground. The question we have as a country, and I think it's something that can be bipartisan, is that we want them to come from places that have a high rule of law, that have high environmental standards and high regard for how we treat local communities. Canada has been a leader traditionally in the mining sector in that way. So it's actually my hope that we would see, strong support, not just from government and industry, but also from environmental groups. If they're really serious about wanting to decarbonize, our economies going forward, they should also be the biggest supporters of strong, well-regulated Canadian miners and the mining industry in this country in general.